Hello, class. Today we're trying something a little new. We are going to be working on sentence versus fragment. Wonderful stuff, I know. So how do we know the difference? A complete sentence is made up of the following items. It has to have a subject, that is the who or the what the sentence is about. It also has to have a predicate, which is a verb phrase, or basically the rest of the sentence. And finally, and this is the one that gets people hung up, is it must be a complete thought. It has to be able to do what we call stand by itself, or in other words, it's an independent clause. Here are some examples. Mrs. Boggess enjoys working outdoors. The class wrote amazing essays. Cats and dogs are wonderful pets. And finally, the audience laughed boisterously and applauded the comedian. How do I know those are complete thoughts? Well, let's break it down. Here we have Mrs. Boggess enjoys working outdoors. Who or what is the sentence about? Well, in this case, it's Mrs. Boggess. What does Mrs. Boggess do? She enjoys working outdoors. So Mrs. Boggess is our subject. Enjoys working outdoors is our predicate. The class wrote amazing essays. So we think about who or what did the action? Well, the class. Therefore, they're the subject. What did the class do? Wrote amazing essays. Cats and dogs are wonderful pets. Well, so what or who are we talking about in this sentence? In this case, it's called a compound subject, and we are talking about cats and dogs. So that is my complete subject, the cats and the dogs. Well, what do cats and dogs do? Well, they are wonderful pets. That's our complete predicate. And finally, the last example that I gave you was the audience laughed boisterously and applauded the comedian. Who or what did something? The audience. That's my subject. What did they do? In this case, they did a couple of things. They laughed boisterously and they applauded the comedian. So in this sentence, we have the audience as our subject and laughed boisterously and applauded the comedian, which would be considered a predicate, but it's a compound because they had two actions in there. So that's the quick review of our sentences. So let's talk about sentence fragments. Well, if you think about it, a sentence has a subject, a predicate, and is a complete thought. Well, fragments are when it is missing one or more of the following. If it doesn't have a subject, it's a fragment. If it's missing a verb, guess what? It's a fragment. And finally, if it is not a complete thought, it's a fragment. Here are some fragments and understanding why they are fragments. Let's look at the first one. Ran around the bases as fast as possible. Okay. Who? Who ran around the bases? In this case, the fragment is missing a subject. Who or what, ran around the bases? It is also not a complete thought because it's missing that subject. It's not a complete thought. When Sally came into the room, okay, you're looking at this going, well, okay, there's a subject, Sally, and there's a verb or predicate, came into the room. You're right. Even though this fragment has a subject, Sally, and a predicate, came into the room, it is not a complete thought because of that word, when. Think about it. We tell you don't start with because, don't start with so, don't start with when, because that makes it an incomplete thought. Because we do not know what happened when she came into the room in this example. On the morning of my driver's test. So, okay, what happened? This fragment is missing both the subject and predicate, and again, it is not a complete thought. If you're left kind of questioning it, it's a fragment. Mrs. Jones's delicious baking lessons. Even though Mrs. Jones is a great baker, we don't know about what happened in her delicious baking lessons because it's missing the predicate. What did the lessons do? Did they help anybody become a better baker? We don't know. It's also an incomplete thought. So to wrap it up, remember, sentences contain a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought. Fragments are missing the subject, predicate, both, or it's simply not a complete thought.